arrived with the speed of an express train, a colossal syrupy wave 30 feet high, bearing down on the streets of Boston's North End. It didn't bring clean water or rushing mud. It brought the suffocating, sticky, brown horror of millions of gallons of fermenting molasses. A sound like a cannon shot, a deafening, splintering boom was the only warning. Then, in the icy grip of a New England winter, the impossible happened. A tropical tide of pure sweetness, traveling at 35 miles per hour, engulfed everything in its path, crushing steel, leveling buildings, and drowning 21 people in a disaster so bizarre it would forever be remembered as an act of God, or perhaps an act of sheer, sticky, corporate greed. Part 1. The Sweetness and the Shadow. The morning of January 15, 1919, in Boston's North End, was one of those deceptively mild, almost spring-like days that sometimes puncture the New England winter. It was a weather anomaly, a brief, pleasant pause in the Cold War between the seasons. The temperature had climbed well above freezing, reaching a giddy 40 degrees Fahrenheit. For the residents, mostly Italian-American immigrants whose lives were a perpetual struggle against cold and poverty, it felt like a small, unexpected blessing. On Commercial Street, right along the waterfront, the atmosphere was usually a cacophony of maritime industry, the rattle of delivery wagons, the shouts of longshoremen, and the ever-present low, metallic rumble of the elevated train tracks overhead. But this morning, there was another scent, another sound, dominating the air. The scent was thick, heavy, and inescapable. It was the deep, cloying, almost alcoholic fragrance of molasses. It emanated from a single, dark, monstrous structure, the colossal storage tank of the Purity Distilling Company. The tank was an industrial giant, 50 feet tall, 90 feet in diameter. It was a riveted steel cylinder holding enough molasses to fill a small lake, specifically 2.3 million gallons of the dense, black liquid, destined to be fermented into industrial alcohol for munitions production. It loomed over the neighborhood like an iron kraken, its very mass an oppressive presence. The molasses was the raw, sticky material of a nation at war and a nation transitioning. Though the Great War had ended just 2 months prior, the demand for industrial alcohol was still immense, and Purity Distilling, a subsidiary of the mighty USIA, was still in the business of high-stakes, high-volume production. Money was being made, fast and furious, and the tank was the tangible expression of that velocity. To the people living in the 3- and 4-story tenement buildings that huddled close to Commercial Street, mere feet from the tank's base, the molasses tank was a nuisance and a mild curiosity. Children, like Anthony D'Estasio, often played near it, occasionally scraping up a bit of the leakage for a forbidden sugary taste. The adults, however, had noticed things. Mr. Agostino Gaeta, who ran a trucking business nearby, had complained to anyone who would listen. He swore that the tank constantly groaned, not a simple settling noise, but a deep, metallic moan that sounded like a ship in a typhoon. He had seen the seams, black with molasses, weeping streams of the thick syrup that stained the ground. In the summer heat, the whole structure would breathe, expanding and contracting, a monstrous living vessel of fermentation. This particular morning, Agostino was preoccupied with loading his drays, but the strange warmth made him pause. He took a deep breath. The smell was stronger than usual, a richer, almost yeasty note mixed with the sweetness. He shrugged it off. Boston was a city of smells. Meanwhile, just across the street, on the second floor of the city stable building, a small group of municipal workers were enjoying their lunch break. This was a place of easy camaraderie, police officers, firemen, and laborers. George Leahy was a young fireman, joking with his colleagues, looking forward to the end of his shift. Life felt normal, predictable, governed by the reassuring rhythm of the clock and the trolley line. Down the street, on the open ground next to the tank, a team of workers was enjoying a break from their toil. And a few blocks away, 10-year-old Pasquale and Tosca was helping his mother run errands, excited by the warmth. Every single thing about the scene was normal, except for the massive 5-story container of explosive sugar strained to its breaking point. No one but the engineers, and perhaps not even them, knew the history of shortcuts and neglect that had gone into the tank's construction. It had been hastily erected in 1915, rushed by the wartime demand for alcohol. The steel was too thin, the bracing was insufficient. Worse, the tank had never been properly tested with water before being filled with heavy molasses. Arthur Gell, the USIA manager in charge, was acutely aware of the weeping seams, but had repeatedly ignored warnings from his chief engineer and from neighborhood residents. The corporate pressure to keep the alcohol supply flowing and to avoid the cost of repairs was simply too great. The molasses inside was now a ticking clock, literally. The unseasonable heat had reactivated the molasses' natural fermentation process, releasing carbon dioxide gas. Inside the colossal tank, the pressure was mounting. It was a silent, internal scream of stressed metal, waiting for the weakest point to give way. At 12:30 p.m., the inevitable happened. The noise, eyewitnesses would later testify, was unlike anything they had ever heard. It wasn't the sound of an explosion in the classic sense. It was the sound of ultimate, violent destruction, a thunderous, splintering metallic boom, so loud it was heard for blocks, sounding to some like a cannon shot or a collapsing elevated train. Then, in the icy grip of a New England winter, the impossible happened. A tropical tide of pure sweetness, traveling at 35 miles per hour, engulfed everything in its path, crushing steel, leveling buildings, and drowning 21 people in a disaster so bizarre it would forever be remembered as an act of God, or perhaps an act of sheer, sticky, corporate greed. The nature of the killer. The molasses had done its initial work with the speed of a projectile, but its lethality was just beginning. It was not like water, which eventually recedes. This was a heavy, dense fluid, nearly 12 pounds per gallon, instantly settling into a treacherous morass. The cooling January air was the disaster's second, cruel partner. As the syrup temperature plummeted, its viscosity shot up exponentially. The molasses quickly transformed from a raging river into something closer to liquid asphalt. People caught in the initial rush were now entombed. They were pinned down by the sheer weight of the flow, then glued to the ground by the rapidly setting sticky mass. Rescue efforts would soon discover that pulling a submerged victim out of the molasses was like pulling a foot out of drying concrete. The smell, which had been a rich, almost pleasant aroma minutes before, became suffocating. The air was saturated with the smell of fermentation and the metallic tang of fear. The initial response: confusion and chaos. The first responders were the neighbors and the few city workers who had survived. The immediate confusion was absolute. What had exploded? A gas main? A terrorist bomb? The year 1919 was tense with labor unrest. When the reality sunk in, a flood of molasses, it seemed so absurd that many arriving police officers and firemen initially thought they were responding to a joke or mass hysteria. The sight was surreal, a section of the city that looked like it had been coated in a giant, greasy brown glaze. The first rescuers found themselves struggling through a knee-deep mire. Every step was a battle. The molasses coated their boots, clinging with incredible tenacity, adding pounds of sticky weight to their gear. Hoses were useless. The suction of the heavy syrup was too much for the pumps. The trapped and the dying. The human stories of the trapped were numerous and horrifying. Antonio di Stasio, this elderly drayman, was driving his cart when the wave hit. Both he and his horse were instantly overwhelmed. The horse, an image of immense strength, was found upright, completely immobilized and drowning in the molasses, a monument to its final, futile struggle. The fireman of Engine 31. The firehouse was moved 15 feet off its foundation. Trapped inside the wreckage and molasses, the men fought for air. George Leahy, the fireman who had been eating lunch, was crushed. Rescuers had to dig through the rubble and the hardening syrup, often finding victims frozen in position, their final screams muffled by the sticky blanket. Pasquale Iantosca, the 10-year-old boy whose name was mentioned in the opening, was struck by a piece of flying debris, likely a splintered wooden beam, that had been carried by the current. He was found yards from his home, the molasses having claimed him after the blow. The rescue process devolved into a gruesome, sticky archaeological dig. Search parties, including U.S. Navy sailors from the USS Nantucket and cadets from the nearby training ship Calabria, were deployed. These servicemen were faced with a uniquely difficult task. They had to use axes and shovels to hack their way through the molasses crust and the tangled wreckage of steel and wood to find bodies. The cleanup, a months-long ordeal. The immediate search for survivors ended relatively quickly, yielding 21 fatalities and 150 injuries. But the cleanup was the most protracted and bizarre phase of the entire ordeal. The molasses had penetrated everywhere. It coated the harbor, turning the water a sickly brown. It had seeped into the basements of buildings not destroyed, ruining entire livelihoods. The only effective cleanup method was using salt water from the harbor mixed with sand and street sweepers, a process that went on for weeks, then months. Every item recovered, pieces of clothing, furniture, tools, had to be submerged in salt water to dissolve the sugar. For years, on hot summer days, residents of the North End swore they could still catch a faint, sweet, fermented aroma hanging in the air. The tragedy had literally stained the landscape. The raw data of the disaster, 21 dead, 150 injured, tells only a fraction of the story. To understand the true weight of the molasses flood, one must live, word by word, through the lives of the people who inhabited that cramped corner of the North End. This section delves into detailed character profiles and the economic realities that placed them directly in harm's way. The North End's heartbeat, a world on the water. The community around Commercial Street was a vibrant, dense tapestry of immigrant life, primarily Italian-American families who had come to Boston seeking opportunity. They were dock workers, fishermen, laborers, and small business owners. For them, the disaster was not just an accident. It was a sudden, violent intrusion into their American dream. The narrative focuses on a few key individuals whose fates were intertwined with the tank. Maria and the children. Maria DeMarco lived in a third-floor tenement just across the street. Her home, like many others, was structurally sound but catastrophically damaged. The molasses didn't just flood the streets, it surged up to the second-floor windows, coating and ruining everything in her first-floor storage area. Her narrative becomes one of homelessness and displacement in the immediate aftermath, detailing the struggle to feed her children when their small savings and all their possessions were destroyed by the sticky tide. The fireman, Billy Stack. Billy, a young man from the Irish side of the North End, had only joined the Boston Fire Department's Engine 31 6 months prior. His story is one of heroism cut tragically short. Caught in the crushing wreckage of the firehouse, his final minutes were a desperate, dark struggle for breath. The detailed account of the other firemen's attempt to tunnel through the hardening molasses to reach him showcases the unique, grotesque challenge of the rescue. The recovery of his body, days later, encased in a syrupy shell, was a devastating blow to the firehouse and the city. Agostino Gaeta's loss. The truckman, Agostino, who had heard the tank's ominous groans, lost 2 of his prized dray horses and the contents of a loaded wagon. For a small business owner, the loss of his animals and equipment was a financial death blow. His testimony in the later trial becomes the voice of the neighborhood, the man who warned, the man who was ignored. His plight highlights the disaster's economic devastation on the working poor. Part 5. The Architect of Failure. Corporate Negligence. The story must now pivot to the perpetrator. The molasses flood wasn't an act of nature. It was a consequence of corporate avarice and stunning negligence. This section provides the detailed forensic backbone for the legal drama to come. The race for alcohol and the cost of haste. The Purity Distilling Company and its parent, USIA, were deeply entrenched in the profitable wartime economy. Molasses was a strategic asset, fermented into ethyl alcohol for explosives and industrial uses. The tank, built in 1915, was a monument to the rush of profit. The designer's conscience. Arthur Gell, the USIA manager, was ostensibly in charge, but the true failure lay in the design and construction.